The cherry blossoms had long since fallen from the imperial palace gardens when Commander Minoru Genda walked the polished corridors of the Naval General Staff Building in Tokyo, his footsteps echoing against the silence that had become all too familiar. It was April 19th, 1942, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed against his chest like the humid air before a typhoon. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's ambitious plan lay spread across the mahogany table before the assembled staff officers, its bold strokes marking carrier positions and attack vectors across the vast Pacific. The admiral's weathered fingers traced the route to Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and sand that would, according to his calculations, become the graveyard of American naval power. Yet Genda felt the cold touch of foreboding as he studied the intricate details. "The American fleet will come," Yamamoto declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack. "They must defend Midway. When they do, we will destroy them completely." The assembled officers nodded in unison, their faces masks of respectful agreement, but Genda noticed the subtle tension in Commander Yasuji Watanabe's shoulders, the way Captain Kameto Kuroshima's eyes flickered with unvoiced concern. The plan was audacious beyond measure. 4 aircraft carriers would strike Midway, while the main battle fleet waited in ambush for the inevitable American response. It would be Pearl Harbor magnified, a decisive blow that would force the United States to sue for peace. But as Genda examined the intelligence reports, questions gnawed at him like termites in ancient wood. "Admiral," Genda ventured, his voice carefully measured, "our intelligence on American carrier positions remains incomplete. What if they are not where we expect them to be?" The room fell silent, and he felt the weight of a dozen stares. Yamamoto's eyes, usually warm with paternal affection for his most brilliant tactician, hardened like winter ice. "The Americans are predictable," the admiral replied curtly. "They will react as we have calculated." But Genda had served under Yamamoto long enough to recognize the defensive edge in his mentor's voice, the way he dismissed uncomfortable truths with increasing frequency since their string of victories had begun to intoxicate the entire Imperial Navy. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's seminal work, The Two-Ocean War, the Japanese High Command had become dangerously overconfident following their early Pacific victories, dismissing intelligence that contradicted their preconceptions. As the meeting dispersed, Genda lingered, hoping for a private moment with the admiral. But Yamamoto had already turned his attention to logistics reports, his mind seemingly closed to further discussion. Walking through the evening shadows of Tokyo, Genda reflected on how the culture of absolute obedience that had served Japan so well in peacetime was now becoming a liability in war. The cherry blossoms would bloom again next spring, but Genda wondered if the empire would still stand to see them. In the distance, the lights of the capital city twinkled like stars, beautiful and fragile, while across the Pacific, an enemy they had awakened prepared its own deadly surprise. Captain Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor's 14th Naval District headquarters, the harsh fluorescent lights casting deep shadows beneath his eyes. The date was May 20th, 1942, and the intercepts crackling through his headphones carried the weight of destiny. His team of codebreakers had been working around the clock, their fingers dancing across cipher machines as they peeled back the layers of Japanese naval communications. "AF is the target," Rochefort muttered to himself, staring at the decoded fragments that revealed Japanese intentions. But AF remained a mystery. Was it the Aleutian Islands, Hawaii, or perhaps the tiny atoll called Midway? The fate of the Pacific War might hang on correctly identifying 2 simple letters. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Tokyo, Commander Genda found himself increasingly isolated within the Naval General Staff. His requests for additional reconnaissance flights over Hawaiian waters had been curtly dismissed, his suggestions for alternative battle plans filed away without discussion. The machine of war had gained momentum, and questioning its direction was now seen as defeatism. "The Americans cannot possibly know our plans," declared Captain Kuroshima during a staff meeting on May 22nd. "Our communication security is absolute." The assembled officers murmured agreement, But Genda noticed how quickly the conversation moved past any mention of American capabilities. It was as if acknowledging enemy strength would somehow weaken their own resolve. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Carrier Striking Force, had his own doubts about the Midway operation, though he voiced them only to his most trusted subordinates. The veteran of Pearl Harbor understood better than most the American capacity for resilience and adaptation. They learned from their mistakes, he confided to his chief of staff as they reviewed attack plans aboard the carrier Akagi. That makes them dangerous, but such concerns found no place in the formal planning sessions. The culture of Kikan, harmonious agreement, demanded that dissenting voices remain silent once the Emperor's representatives had spoken. Lower-ranking officers like Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, hero of the Pearl Harbor attack, kept their tactical concerns to themselves, unwilling to challenge the wisdom of their superiors. Back in Hawaii, Rochefort's breakthrough came through an ingenious deception. He convinced his superiors to send a fake message stating that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese intercepts mentioned that AF was experiencing fresh water problems. The target was confirmed. Midway Atoll would be the stage for the next great naval battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received this intelligence with grim satisfaction. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, the soft-spoken Texan actively sought out dissenting opinions, encouraged debate among his staff, and welcomed intelligence that contradicted his assumptions. "I want to know what the enemy can do to us," he told his assembled commanders, not just what we hope to do to them. The contrast in command philosophy was becoming stark. While American planners prepared for multiple contingencies and positioned their forces based on the best available intelligence, Japanese decision-makers had become prisoners of their own success. Victory disease, as some would later call it, had infected the Imperial Navy's highest levels. As May drew to a close, 2 fleets prepared for battle across the vast Pacific. One sailed with the confidence of certainty, the other with the humility of preparation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the deadly cost of silencing dissent in the face of mortal combat. The morning sun painted the flight deck of the carrier Akagi in shades of gold and crimson as Admiral Nagumo's strike force departed Japanese waters on May 27, 1942. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the spearhead of what many believed would be Japan's final crushing blow against American naval power. But beneath the ceremonial pageantry and stirring martial music, unease rippled through the ranks like an underwater current. Commander Genda stood at the bridge rail, watching the escort destroyers cut through the Pacific swells in perfect formation. The sight should have filled him with pride, yet he found himself counting the ways their intelligence might be flawed. Radio intercepts suggested American submarine activity near Midway had increased dramatically, but when he had presented this information to the planning staff, Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka had dismissed it as routine patrol activity. "The Americans are blind to our approach," Kusaka had declared with absolute certainty. "Our diversionary attack on the Aleutians will draw their attention north while we strike the decisive blow at Midway." But Genda knew that American cryptanalysts had proven surprisingly capable throughout the war. What if they were sailing into a trap? Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, still recovering from appendicitis surgery but determined to lead the Midway strike, shared Genda's concerns in private moments stolen between briefings. "Something feels different this time," he confided as they studied reconnaissance photographs of Midway's defenses. "The Americans fortified that atoll like they knew we were coming. Their suspicions found validation in subtle ways that higher command refused to acknowledge. Radio traffic analysis suggested unusual American fleet movements, but Admiral Yamamoto's staff had become experts at dismissing inconvenient intelligence. The pattern of selective hearing that had begun in Tokyo now infected every level of the operation. Meanwhile, unknown to the Japanese fleet, Admiral Nimitz had positioned his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway in a carefully planned ambush. Unlike the Japanese decision-makers, Nimitz had built his strategy around the assumption that his intelligence might be incomplete or his enemy more capable than expected. Captain Miles Browning, Rear Admiral William Halsey's chief of staff temporarily, serving with Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise, epitomized the American approach to uncertainty. "We'll plan for what we know," he told the assembled squadron commanders, "and stay flexible enough to adapt when we discover what we don't know." The cultural divide between the two fleets extended far beyond mere tactics. American pilots like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay were encouraged to voice concerns about attack plans, suggest modifications based on their combat experience, and even challenge targeting priorities when circumstances demanded. Their Japanese counterparts, constrained by rigid hierarchy and the shame of appearing disloyal, kept such thoughts to themselves. As reported in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, Japanese overconfidence had reached dangerous levels by early June 1942, with senior commanders dismissing intelligence that contradicted their operational assumptions. On the evening of June 3rd, as both fleets converged on their fateful meeting point, Admiral Nagumo received his final intelligence briefing. The reports contained disturbing hints of American preparedness, increased air patrols, suspicious radio silence from Pearl Harbor, and reconnaissance flights that seemed unusually aggressive. A prudent commander might have requested additional intelligence flights or modified the attack timing. Instead, Nagumo chose to trust in the infallibility of his superiors' planning. The die was cast, the ships committed to their courses, and the great gamble of the Pacific War was about to begin. In less than 24 hours, the cost of ignoring dissent would be measured in burning steel and brave men's lives, while the ocean itself would judge which fleet had prepared more wisely for the uncertainties of battle. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, hung heavy over the Pacific as Admiral Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind to launch their first strike against Midway Atoll. The rhythmic thrum of aircraft engines filled the air as 108 bombers and fighters lifted off from the E-4 flight decks, their navigation lights disappearing into the gloom like falling stars in reverse. Commander Genda watched the launch operations with growing unease. The attack wave was smaller than he had recommended, but Admiral Kusaka had insisted that a portion of their aircraft be held in reserve, armed with anti-ship weapons in case American naval forces appeared unexpectedly. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, neither providing overwhelming strength against Midway's defenses, nor maintaining adequate striking power against potential naval targets. "First reports from the reconnaissance flight, sir," announced a communications officer, handing Nagumo a decoded message. The Admiral's weathered face remained impassive as he read, but Genda noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. The Yi scout planes had found nothing, no American carriers lurking in the expected positions, no sign of the fleet that intelligence had promised would rush to Midway's defense. But absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, a principle that seemed lost on the Japanese command structure. "The Americans are hiding," declared Captain Kuroshima with satisfaction. "They lack the courage to meet us in open battle." Such dismissive confidence had become the norm among Yamamoto's staff, but Genda remembered the fierce resistance they had encountered at Pearl Harbor, the way American pilots had fought with desperate courage, even while caught completely off guard. Unknown to the Japanese fleet, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were positioned exactly where Captain Joseph Rochefort's intelligence team had predicted they would need to be. Admiral Spruance, temporarily commanding while Admiral Halsey recovered from illness, embodied a different philosophy of command. Where Japanese leaders sought confirmation of their preconceptions, Spruance actively sought information that might contradict his assumptions. "Launch when ready," Spruance ordered his air group commanders as dawn broke over the Pacific. Unlike the Japanese, who held back significant reserves based on theoretical contingencies, the American admiral committed his full striking power to the initial attack. It was a calculated risk based on accurate intelligence rather than hopeful speculation. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Lieutenant Howard Ady, piloting a consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat on routine patrol, spotted the Japanese fleet. His radio crackled to life. "Many planes heading Midway bearing 320, distance 150. The message reached Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor within minutes, confirming what codebreakers had already predicted. But for the Japanese, The first sign of trouble came not from their own reconnaissance, but from the ferocity of Midway's defensive response. American fighters rose to meet the incoming strike with unexpected coordination, while anti-aircraft fire proved far more accurate than intelligence had suggested. The American garrison had not been caught sleeping as at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Midway strike, radioed back a message that should have sent chills through the Japanese command. There is need for a second attack wave. The fortifications were stronger, the defenses more determined, and the American will to fight more resilient than anyone had anticipated. Admiral Nagumo faced the first of several crucial decisions that would determine the battle's outcome. His reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against ships, but Tomonaga's request demanded high-explosive bombs suitable for ground targets. Standard doctrine called for keeping the anti-ship weapons in case enemy naval forces appeared, but the immediate tactical situation seemed to demand flexibility. At 07:15 hours, Nagumo made his fateful choice. Prepare to rearm. Aircraft for second attack on Midway. The decision reflected everything wrong with Japanese command philosophy, a focus on immediate tactical concerns, while ignoring strategic intelligence. Within minutes, ordnance crews began the dangerous process of changing weapons configurations, leaving the fleet's aircraft in their most vulnerable state just as American dive bombers approached their final attack positions. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles, where the cost of dismissing dissent would be measured in sunken carriers and shattered dreams of empire. The clock aboard the carrier Akagi read 0920 hours when the first American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon, their obsolescent, devastator aircraft struggling toward the Japanese fleet in what many would later call a suicide mission. Admiral Nagumo watched from his bridge as Zero fighters swooped down upon the attackers like hunting hawks, their machine guns tearing through fabric and flesh with mechanical precision. Commander Genda felt a moment of grim satisfaction as the torpedo attack dissolved into chaos and burning wreckage. 41 American aircraft had attacked, only 6 would return to their carriers. But his relief proved premature, for the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and its sister units had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches virtually undefended. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour when he spotted the destroyer Arashi racing northward to rejoin the main formation. Following the wake of this single ship, he led his squadron directly to the heart of Nagumo's force. At 10:24 hours, McCluskey pushed over into his dive, followed by 37 dauntless bombers whose screaming engines announced the arrival of American vengeance. The timing could not have been worse for the Japanese. Flight decks crowded, with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, ammunition scattered across hangar decks, and fuel lines snaking between parked planes created a catastrophe waiting to happen. The very efficiency that had made the Imperial Navy the scourge of the Pacific now became its greatest vulnerability. Admiral Nagumo stood transfixed as the first bomb struck his flagship. The carrier Akagi, pride of the combined fleet, shuddered under multiple hits that penetrated her flight deck and exploded among the aircraft being prepared for launch. Within moments, secondary explosions began tearing through her bowels as aviation gasoline ignited in towering pillars of flame. "We are under attack by dive bombers," the obvious report crackled through the communication system, but damage control parties were already discovering the extent of their disaster. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, fought desperately to save his ship, but the fires had gained too much headway. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack was dying beneath his feet. Simultaneously, the carriers Kaga and Soryu suffered similar fates as American bombs found their most vulnerable moments. Commander Richard Best's section of dive bombers from Enterprise struck Akagi with devastating precision, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from Yorktown demolished Soryu in a matter of minutes. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, aircraft, pilots, and ships, vanished in explosions that could be seen for 50 miles. Only the carrier Hiryu survived the initial American attack, her captain having wisely separated from the main formation. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu's division, embodied the kind of tactical flexibility that the Japanese command structure had systematically discouraged. Without waiting for orders from Nagumo, he launched immediate counterstrikes against the American fleet. But even Yamaguchi's aggressive response revealed the fundamental flaw in Japanese planning. His air crews, briefed to expect only 2 American carriers in the area, focused their attacks on Yorktown while Enterprise and Hornet remained untouched. The intelligence failure that had begun in Tokyo now manifested itself in tactical confusion at the moment of greatest crisis. As documented in military historian John Keegan's analysis, The Price of Admiralty, the Battle of Midway demonstrated how organizational culture could determine military outcomes as decisively as weapon technology or numerical superiority. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his position aboard the battleship Yamato 300 miles to the west, finally understood the cost of his staff's overconfidence. The 4 carriers that represented Japan's primary offensive capability were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews scattered to the winds or dead in the Pacific depths. By noon on June 4th, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. The Japanese Empire's expansion had reached its high water mark, and the long retreat toward the home islands had begun. The silence that had greeted dissenting voices in Tokyo's planning rooms had finally found its voice in the thunder of exploding bombs and the screams of dying ships. The setting sun of June 4, 1942, painted the Pacific waters crimson as Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag from the burning Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, his face a mask of controlled devastation. Behind him, 3 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, blazed like funeral pyres against the darkening sky, their steel hulls groaning as seawater fought the fires consuming their vitals. Commander Genda, his uniform, singed from the explosions that had nearly claimed his life, stood beside his admiral as they watched their dreams of empire sink beneath the waves. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had fought valiantly through the afternoon, her aircraft damaging the American carrier Yorktown before succumbing to a final American strike. Now Admiral Yamaguchi and his crew prepared for their own rendezvous with eternity, the last act of a tragedy that had begun in the conference rooms of Tokyo. "How could our intelligence have been so wrong?" Nagumo asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of rescue operations. It was a question that had haunted Genda throughout the day's disasters, but one whose answer reached far beyond simple intelligence failures. The American codebreakers had indeed penetrated Japanese communications, but the greater failure lay in a command structure that had systematically silenced those who might have questioned the assumptions underlying Operation MI. Captain Joseph Rochefort, still working in his basement headquarters at Pearl Harbor despite the sounds of celebration echoing through the corridors above, understood better than most what had just occurred. They believed their own propaganda, he explained, to a visiting intelligence officer. When you stop listening to dissent, you stop learning from reality. The Japanese had possessed capable intelligence officers, experienced tacticians, and brave fighting men. But their culture of absolute obedience had transformed these strengths into fatal weaknesses. The final irony came as Admiral Yamamoto, receiving increasingly desperate reports from the battle area, made his last crucial decision of the campaign. Rather than risking his battleships in a night action that might salvage something from the disaster, he chose to withdraw the entire fleet back toward Japan. The same caution that might have prevented the disaster if applied earlier now ensured that nothing could be saved from its wreckage. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, one of the few survivors of the morning's torpedo attacks, summarized the American perspective as he was debriefed aboard Enterprise. They flew straight and level, just like in peacetime exercises. No evasive action, no tactical flexibility. It was like they'd never considered the possibility of serious opposition. The observation revealed the fundamental difference between the two naval cultures, one that encouraged adaptation and innovation, another that prized conformity and hierarchical obedience above battlefield effectiveness. As news of the victory reached Washington, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox reflected on intelligence reports that had predicted Japanese overconfidence. "Pride goeth before destruction," he noted in his diary, quoting the ancient proverb that seemed particularly relevant to the day's events. The Japanese had achieved remarkable success in the war's early months, but their victories had bred an arrogance that made catastrophic defeat almost inevitable. The human cost of ignoring dissent became clear in the days following the battle. Japan had lost not only 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, but also the cream of her naval aviation. Experienced pilots whose training had taken years to complete and whose skills could not be quickly replaced. The Empire's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken in a single day, and with it, any realistic hope of forcing the United States to accept a negotiated peace. Commander Genda, destined to survive the war and later reflect on its lessons, would spend decades analyzing what had gone wrong at Midway. His conclusion, shared with a generation of military historians, was simple yet profound. An organization that cannot tolerate dissent cannot adapt to reality, and reality is the final judge of all military planning. The cherry blossoms would bloom again in Tokyo, but the empire that had dismissed the voices of caution was already beginning its long decline toward surrender. The Battle of Midway had demonstrated that in warfare, as in nature, those who cannot adapt to changing circumstances are destined for extinction. The silence that had once seemed like strength had revealed itself as the weakness that doomed an empire to defeat. The end.